Thank you very much, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for having me. I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about where we are in the arc of the energy crisis, and I want to talk about the future and the energy transition and supply chains. So where we are in the arc of the energy crisis, last year was a massive macroeconomic shock for Europe in terms of energy. Just to give you some figures, Europe spends about 80 billion euros a year to import natural gas. That's sort of the long-term average. Last year, we spent 316, right? So that's the type of increase that we saw, 4x last year, in terms of the shock that we had to absorb, which triggered support for consumers and other things. And even today, we are still living with the consequences of that shock. If you look at aggregate macroeconomic data, you can sort of see it, sometimes yes, sometimes no, depending on the country. If you look at aggregate industrial production data, again, the same thing, maybe you can see it, maybe not. If you look at industrial production and you rank it by energy intensity, it's incredibly visible, where we have lost in energy-intensive sectors like metals and chemicals and wood and paper. We've lost about 10–15% of production at the European level over the last 2 years. And obviously, and you heard that from the previous speakers, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but energy produced or added to inflationary pressures, which we are still living with today, and it also provoked a response from central banks and higher interest rates, which we are also living with today. So relative to where we were in 2022, we are now going back into a winter. Winter is sort of the more dangerous part of the European energy system today because most of the challenge has been on natural gas. We use a lot more natural gas in winter than we do in summer, and so being able to meet European demand in summer is not difficult. Being able to meet European demand in winter is actually difficult. And so on the price front, relative to the prices that we saw last year, and the price that we saw were, insane, I think is the technical term. Just to give you a sense, because European gas is usually quoted in euros per megawatt, and very few people understand euros per megawatt, but most people understand dollars per barrel. If you convert the gas into oil equivalent terms, last August, the price of gas was about $600 a barrel, right? That was the price that we faced a year ago in late August in Europe. Relative to that, things are much better. We're about 80–90% down on natural gas. And so we're going into the winter with what most analysts assume or think is a relatively robust balance. We have filled up our storage. We've reduced our demand for natural gas. We've reduced our demand for electricity. We have growth in renewables. We have growth in hydro, which last year did poorly at the European level. We have some recovery from French nuclear. All those things, when you add them together, they paint a relatively improved picture for Europe going to the winter, but it's still a very tight market. And so it is a market that is incredibly jittery. Whenever something happens, price can go up very quickly. And so it is definitely something that continues to be of concern, even though, going into the winter at the European level, things are looking quite positive. However, if you step back, the reality is that we have a structural challenge in Europe, which is that we lost Russian gas, and we have replaced this Russian gas, indeed. We paid a lot more for it last year. We're still paying more for it than we were paying for Russian gas years ago. But we also mostly bought this gas in the open market. To put it simply, we bought it cargo by cargo. And there is no guarantee that this gas will continue to come to Europe. And even if we have a very successful energy transition, we're going to be short on gas as Europe for the next 10 to 15 years, right? And so this doesn't mean that these prices will persist for 10 or 15 years. It means that for the next 10 to 15 years, we need to be pulling in significant volumes of gas from the rest of the world. And at this moment, we're essentially very exposed to what happens to the rest of the world because very little of this gas is committed to come to Europe. So that, from a structural perspective, is, I think, the biggest challenge that we face in energy markets is the overall tightness, but also the fact that as Europe, I'm not talking about Greece, but as Europe, we are highly exposed to those international dynamics, and small shifts in that environment could have big impacts in terms of the price that we pay for energy. Let me now switch to talk a little bit more about climate policy. And I think what you've seen over the last year, year and a half, particularly with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, is essentially the fusion, the merging of climate policy, industrial policy, and trade policy. Put very simply, there is very little climate policy left in the world that is primarily or purely about climate. It is about resilience, it is about economics, it is about economic security, it's about jobs, it's about value chains and supply chains, in addition to being about reducing emissions. And the reality that we face is that if you look at these supply chains, the supply chains not for the goods that we're consuming now, but also of the goods whose importance we know is going to grow over the next 10, 15 years. What is very clear is that if you look at a map of supply chains, across the board you see a lot of red, right? These are supply chains where China has a very prominent role. In some places, the role is essentially dominant, like solar photovoltaics and the early stages of battery production. In other areas, it's just very big, like wind, and obviously in electric vehicles, right? So the reality is that the technologies that we have scaled to address climate over the last decade and a half, the value chains for those supply chains have very much grown and matured in China. Now, and this is something a little bit more on the positive side of things. If you look at the world ex-China, actually Europe has a much stronger industrial position in these products than the United States. If you look at electric vehicles, if you look at wind, if you look at hydrogen, electrolyzer production, which we use for hydrogen production, Europe actually tends to have a much greater presence in those markets than the United States. So in some ways, one could look at efforts like the Inflation Reduction Act as an attempt to not just sort of compete with China, which is the obvious thing, but also in practical terms, in some ways, catch up to the European lead in some of these markets. It's definitely true, clearly, for electric vehicles. In offshore wind, Europe is far, far ahead of where the United States is today. And so I think it's quite important in thinking about the European response not to be sort of reductionist and nihilistic and think everything's in China and now everything's going to be in America, because the reality is that over the last 10, 15 years, yes, a huge part of these supply chains have been built in China, but at the same time, Europe actually has managed in certain sectors to maintain a very strong foothold and certainly greater than what the United States has been able to do in that same period of time. And I think the real challenge that we face is when you think about industrial policy, you basically have two broad risks. You can waste a lot of money in supporting firms, and you can also, in supporting firms, sort of move away from the principles of trade and lose out on all the benefits that the two previous speakers sort of talked about. And in certain ways, what we've seen, if you think of the three main economic poles of the world, the United States, Europe, and China, we've seen both of the other two economic poles sort of engage in climate policy that has some of these features, right? Very generous support, in some ways not necessarily sort of with a cost-benefit framework, but more in terms of wanting to create supply chains and jobs, even if you sort of spend a lot of money in the process. and also support in ways that may not follow the rule book of the WTO. And so what we have, I think, in Europe is, if you look on the one hand at the track record that I talked about, I think there's something to be said about that slightly more cautious European approach of wanting to support, but being mindful of not overdoing it, keeping an eye out on the internal market and making sure that you don't have countries that have additional fiscal space being able to support way more than countries that don't have equivalent fiscal space, but also being mindful of creating industrial policy that is not about sort of closing your market and trying to sever your ties with the rest of the world, which if we did that, realistically speaking, for climate at least, it would be quite challenging since so many of these value chains are globally integrated and also depend on China. I mean, if you look at Chinese electric vehicle exports, more than half of them are manufactured by US and European companies, right? So yes, they're Chinese exports, but they're Chinese exports by sort of Western firms, right? So that interconnectedness has been a key part of how we've been able to build up scale and how we've been able to bring down the cost of these technologies. And so I think as we think about the future and the position of Europe, I think there's something to be said about that slightly more balanced approach that Europe is taking to supply chains. So just to wrap up, on the energy front, huge shock, still living with the consequences. Things are looking so much better relative to where they were last year, feeling very good about where we are in the winter, but we still have a structural disadvantage based on our exposure in the international market for natural gas. And on the climate side of things, in this world where climate and industrial policy and trade policy are fusing together, and I think you're seeing countries sort of do climate policy primarily through the lens of industrial policy and trade policy. I think there's something to be said about a European approach that tries to maintain a balance between these different objectives and doesn't just go sort of all in on one direction. And in fact, the track record of the last decade, I think, shows that there's wisdom in that approach. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Nico, for the timeliness, but also for the both realistic but also net positive tone. On one hand, as you mentioned, jittery energy markets, but it feels that we are going into a 23-24 winter without the fears of the previous winter. And I truly appreciated both the analysis and the insight on climate policy around the advances of technology allowing us to deal with the climate challenge, about strengths of the EU versus the US in these technological fronts. And in fact, a lot of what we are looking at as challenges from the US, like the IRA being a policy to catch up for the US with the EU, and also the right perspective around European industrial policy, bringing a balanced perspective around supporting, but also keeping the mind on the internal market as well.